Hello to you. I do hope you're well. Welcome to this AQA A-Level Religious Studies video. I'm Ben Wardle, and today we are revising Aristotle's virtue ethics. So we'll be talking through the AO1 knowledge and the AO2 evaluation points that you need to know for an A-star essay. And on paper one, we could be asked to examine or evaluate virtue ethics, and we could also be asked to apply virtue ethics to one of the human or non-human moral issues. And don't forget, you can refer to virtue ethics on paper 2 as part of your 25-mark dialogues answers. Now, in this video, we'll be talking through the key components to virtue ethics. So this is like the contents page to the video. We'll start with a look at the fact virtue ethics are character-based. We'll talk about Aristotle's idea of eudaimonia, which means human flourishing. We'll talk about his hierarchy of souls, which places humans at the top with their rational souls. And we'll talk about the importance of reason and reasoning for Aristotle. We'll mention arete, which is moral excellence, and theoria, which means contemplation. We'll, of course, talk about the virtues themselves, including how to calculate a virtue as being in that golden mean, as that midpoint between two extremes, excess on one hand and deficiency on the other. We'll also talk about the cardinal virtues of prudence, justice, temperance, and fortitude. And we'll talk about phronesis, which is practical wisdom, as well as the phronimos, who is the expert in practical wisdom. We'll also talk about two contemporary scholars, Martha Nussbaum and Barry Schwartz, and their views on virtue ethics. They have very much led, along with Anscombe, a revival in virtue ethics. So Martha Nussbaum, for example, likes the fact it takes a holistic approach and that it is a person-centered approach to ethics. And Barry Schwartz really likes it because instead of giving people rules to follow, it actually instills within them moral virtues and gives them the skills to make moral decisions. And he uses a brilliant case study of a hospital janitor that we'll be talking about today and that you can then use in your A-star essays. And then, of course, in terms of our AO2, we will be evaluating virtue ethics. So we'll be looking at the strengths of virtue ethics and also the weaknesses. Let's have a look now at some key quotes that you can include in an A-star essay on virtue ethics. Because remember, in order to secure that A-star, you need to make sure that you are referring to scholars and what they have said. So hopefully these quotes will be very memorable for you, and then you can use them in your essays on this topic. So Aristotle said that excellence is a habit. He also said that excellence is never an accident. Barry Schwartz said that moral skill is chipped away by a reliance on rules. Aristotle said that the good life is when we reason well. He also said that justice is every virtue summed up. Aristotle also said that one swallow does not make a summer, and that reflects the fact that virtue ethics are character-based, and it's about your personal development and your moral development over the course of your lifetime. Aristotle said, in terms of calculating a virtue, that a virtue is a mean with respect to two vices, excess and deficiency. Martha Nussbaum said that Aristotle describes the cultivation of a whole person, so it takes that holistic approach to ethics. And then Barry Schwartz said that rules and procedures spare us from thinking. And so he really likes virtue ethics because it teaches us how to think for ourselves, how to decide for ourselves, how to develop phronesis, which is practical wisdom, so that we become a phronimos, who is the expert or an expert in practical wisdom. So I've mentioned a couple of times, and this is really important to know, that virtue ethics are character-based. So this approach to ethics focuses on character development rather than rules. And it is based on the belief that a person with moral virtues is more likely to behave ethically than someone who purely follows the rules. So it's not good enough to just give people rules to follow, but actually you need to develop their character. They need to cultivate virtues so that they can then go out into the world and live a moral life. Therefore, virtue ethics is seen as person-based rather than action-based. It is focused on developing moral excellence, which means the ability to exercise virtues, rather than prescribing rules to be followed. So it does not ask, what should I do in terms of what rules should I follow? Instead, it asks, who should I be. And Martin Nussbaum actually really encapsulates all of this with this brilliant quote here. Now, you don't need to memorize all of it. I would say just memorize those key bits that I've identified that you can then just drop into an essay, as that shows your examiner you've got that expertise on what contemporary scholars have said about virtue ethics. So she said that Aristotle's norm of a reasonable person is one whose character is infused completely by the correct reason for action, which have shaped all their motives and attitudes. And here's the important bit. She said, because he aims to describe the cultivation of a whole person and a way of life, rather than simply to prescribe a list of duties, he has ample scope for discussing emotional self-shaping. So he's aiming to describe the cultivation of a whole person and a way of life. So he's not just giving you rules to follow. It's about developing virtue. It's about your character development over the course of your lifetime. So it puts people at the center rather than just prescribing rules, because of course the key aim here, and we're going to talk about this now, is achieving eudaimonia, which is human flourishing. So let's talk about Aristotle, shall we? He is the main man behind virtue ethics. He developed this and he wrote about this in his Nicomachean Ethics over 2,000 years ago. And he was an ancient Greek philosopher. He's seen as one of the founding fathers of Western philosophy alongside Plato and Socrates. He is considered to be one of the most influential and important philosophers in human history, and he's contributed to countless disciplines that go way beyond philosophy and ethics. So, for example, science, politics, and the arts. He was an empiricist, which means knowledge is gained via experience, and he believed that everything has four causes: a formal cause, efficient cause, material cause, and final cause. And the final cause is something's telos, which means its purpose. He believed that everything in the universe and the universe itself has a telos. And as I say, that means a purpose. And he believed that the telos, so the purpose of human life, is to achieve eudaimonia. And that means flourishing. So it is the fulfillment of your full potential. And this is the starting point. This is the foundation, if you like, for virtue ethics. So let's talk about this in a bit more detail. Aristotle's starting point is the teleological claim that every action is aimed at attaining some good aim. And this is the final cause, which is its telos, its purpose. So the purpose something has that it moves towards fulfilling. And remember, he believed that everything in the universe and the universe itself has a telos. It has a final cause. He believed that the final and ultimate end to which human action is geared is eudaimonia, and this can be translated as flourishing. So it's about achieving a supreme state of happiness where you fulfill your potential. Now, importantly, this is not attained through pleasure or wealth. So if we think about what John Stuart Mill, for example, said about higher and lower pleasures, this is not about pursuing those lower pleasures. Instead, we achieve eudaimonia through the pursuit of virtue, excellence, and becoming the best we can be. And there is a great quote there actually from Hutter and Waterman. They said, it is achieved through the pursuit of virtue, excellence, and the best within us. And Aristotle believed that that is the purpose of human life, to fulfill your full potential and to flourish. And he believed that our human ability to reason and the cultivation of virtues plays a very important role in achieving eudaimonia. And eudaimonia is the task of a lifetime. You know, it's not something we can instantly achieve. It is something that happens over the course of our lives. It is something that we are working towards achieving and fulfilling, because remember, it is the final cause of our lives. It is the telos of our lives that we want to fulfill. And he believed that we as humans are what we repeatedly do. He said that excellence is a habit, and we're going to talk about that more in a few moments' time. But just for now, as the starting point to Aristotle's virtue ethics, it's really important you know he believed the purpose of human life is eudaimonia, and that this can be achieved through the pursuit of virtue, excellence, and the best within us. So let's talk a bit more about reason now, because he's also very evangelical about the importance of reason and reasoning within human life. And I want to start with this brilliant quote from his Nicomachean Ethics. in which he writes that the good life is not the kind in which we eat, reproduce, sense, move, remember, or imagine well. He says plants and animals can do that, but that in which we reason well. So again, very similar to John Stuart Mill's later ideas on higher and lower pleasures. Mill was very much influenced and inspired by Aristotle. So Aristotle believed that our ability to reason sets humans apart from animals and plants. He saw human beings as unique in their possession of a rational soul, so the highest form. He had his hierarchy of souls, which we'll have a look at in a moment, which had human beings at the top, because they have a rational soul. And he believed the uniqueness of the human soul, so the thing that makes it distinct and particularly valuable, lies in its capacity for rational thought. And rational thought, reasoning, just means to be able to think, reflect, consider, understand, evaluate, analyze, and judge. So it's those higher order, higher level thinking skills. Reasoning well, he believed, is how humans attain goodness and achieve eudaimonia. And so in order to achieve eudaimonia, you need to reason well. And, you know, this is so important. Again, we've got to focus on eudaimonia. We've got to focus on reasoning as these two key concepts that underpin virtue ethics. So, as I say, he said that the good life is not the kind in which we just eat, reproduce, sense, move, remember, or imagine well, but that in which we reason well. So we're going to start at the bottom of his hierarchy, which is where we have the vegetative soul, which is what plants have, because they are capable of nutrition and growth. So they are at the very bottom of his hierarchy. The next tier up is where we find animals with their sensitive soul, because as well as nutrition and growth, they can also engage in movement, sense perception, and then low level thought. But they're not going to be philosophizing, are they? And then at the very top of that hierarchy, we have humans with their rational soul, because again, they can also engage in all the things that plants and animals do. But the thing that makes humans distinct and sets them apart at the top of that hierarchy is their ability to reason. So he says, well, that tells us how we achieve our human purpose, which is eudaimonia. It's got to be something to do with reasoning. So it's about those higher order, higher level thinking skills. So he wants people to be philosophizing. He wants them to be thinking deeply, because that is something that only human beings can do. And that is something that will help them to therefore achieve the human purpose, which is eudaimonia. Again, this is very similar to Mill's later ideas on those higher and lower pleasures. So that might help you to understand Aristotle's ideas here and remember what he means, that reason is something very unique to human beings and is something that we need to focus on. Can I just apologize that my phone keeps going off, by the way? I should have put that on silent. I do apologize. So, as we've mentioned, he said, the good life is one in which we reason well. And he believed that reasoning well involves exercising virtue, which means moral excellence. So it's about developing and cultivating moral excellence, arete. And he therefore believed that the good life involves theoria, which is contemplation, because that is when you are engaging in reasoning and you are thinking deeply, which, remember, is something unique to human beings, which is therefore going to lead him to believing that it helps us to achieve eudaimonia. Now, here's a really important question. How do we actually become virtuous? Because, of course, as we've said, virtue ethics is about your character development. It's about your personal development. It doesn't give you rules. It says you need to become a virtuous person. And remember, it's all about what we repeatedly do. Excellence is a habit. So how do we become virtuous? Well, Aristotle believed that it is the task of a lifetime as we pursue excellence and eudaimonia. So it is not something, as I say, that you can instantly achieve. It is something that we develop over the course of our entire lives, which is why he said, one swallow does not make a summer. With virtue ethics, becoming virtuous, developing moral excellence is the task of an entire lifetime. So what kind of things should we be doing over the course of our lives in order to become virtuous, in order to become that Pheronimos, that expert in practical wisdom? Well, We need to engage in repetition, which helps us to form habits, and it's got to be good habits. So it's got to be the habit of exercising virtue. Remember, Aristotle believed we are what we repeatedly do. Excellence is a habit. So it's the fact that every single day you've got to be exercising virtues habitually so that it becomes second nature. So you don't actually need rules to follow because you are habitually a good, virtuous person. Imitation is also important. We need to observe and emulate role models, and they need to be good role models. They need to be people further along that journey to virtue than we are. So they need to be the Pheronimoses of the world, those who are experts in practical wisdom. We need to imitate and emulate them. We need to do what they do. We also need education, which provides us with the knowledge and helps us to develop our use of reason. So education, very important for Aristotle. Remember, he is an empiricist. He believes that we learn through experience. And talking of experience, we need to have a lot of it. He said that we practice and apply virtues over the course of our lives. And the more that we do that, the better at it we get. So in order to become virtuous, there needs to be repetition, there needs to be imitation, there needs to be education, and there needs to be experience. So let's have a look at these virtues in detail, shall we? He believes that the human soul has a rational part and a non-rational part. And within the rational part, we've got the intellectual virtues that can be taught. Whereas in the non-rational part, we have got the moral virtues, which are formed by habit. Remember, excellence is a habit. So there needs to be that repetition, that practice, that imitation. In terms of what you actually need to know for the exam, I do not expect you to now memorize all 9 of the intellectual virtues and all of the moral virtues. There are 12 in total. You do not need to do that. We just need to know the primary intellectual virtues, in particular Phronesis, and then the 4 primary moral virtues, also known as the cardinal virtues. So we're going to talk through those now. But just before we move on, please always remember that Aristotle believed that reasoning well, which is so important and it is so unique to human beings, means exercising virtue, which is how we achieve that moral excellence. So let's start by talking about the 5 primary intellectual virtues, which, as I say, it is important we know. And in particular, we need to know Phronesis, which is practical wisdom. The others are techne, which is having artistry or craftsmanship. There is then nous, which is your intuition and understanding. We have episteme, which is scientific knowledge, very important for Aristotle, of course. He was very influential in the history of science. And Sophia, which is philosophical wisdom. And as I've put there, remember the Pheronimos, who we should be emulating and imitating, is someone who is an expert in practical wisdom. So knowing what to do and what moral decisions to make when they are faced with different situations and scenarios throughout their lives. So they are the 5 primary intellectual virtues. In terms of a Pheronimos, excuse me then, a Pheronimos, remember, is an expert in Phronesis, and Phronesis is practical wisdom. So what actually does this mean? Let's break it down. Barry Schwartz says that a person with practical wisdom knows when to follow and when to ignore a rule. So that's what practical wisdom actually means, when you should follow a rule and when you should actually ignore it. They also know how to improvise, so how to think on their feet. They know how to use their skills in pursuit of the right aim, and they know that wisdom depends on experience. They also know that failure is okay, that people need mentoring by wise people on how to care, that people do not need to be brilliant to be wise, and that without wisdom, brilliance can lead to trouble. So the Pheronimos, who is the expert in practical wisdom, is somebody that is able to think for themselves and that they're able to make those moral decisions as they navigate through life. And remember, Phronesis is really important for Aristotle's virtue ethics because this is about you thinking for yourself. Remember, virtue ethics is not about giving you a list of duties or rules that need to be followed. It's about you pursuing moral excellence. It's about you developing those virtues so that you can think for yourself and you can make the right decisions and you will habitually do the right thing. You don't actually need rules. You don't need to be told what to do because you have got Phronesis, which means practical wisdom. which means the ability to think and decide and to know for yourself. We then have our 4 cardinal moral virtues, which are prudence, justice, temperance, and fortitude. And Aristotle believed that developing and exercising these virtues makes a person good and leads to human flourishing. And just as a little note on the influence Aristotle did have, his 4 cardinal virtues were hugely influential on St. Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas was very, very influenced by Aristotle. You know, he took lots of Aristotle's ideas and he tried to synthesize them with Catholic teachings. And he was very influenced by this idea of these moral virtues. He actually incorporated them into Christian moral thinking, and they are to be developed within a Christian now alongside the 3 theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity. Now, just a quick word on justice, a really important virtue, because Aristotle believed that justice is every virtue summed up. So in a minute, we're going to look at the idea of virtues being a golden mean between 2 extremes, between 2 vices. You've got excess on the one hand and deficiency on the other. But actually, justice does not have 2 extremes, because it is instead every virtue summed up. And that illustrates how important justice is for Aristotle and in his thinking. So how do we perform the virtues well? As I say, he believed that your virtue is located in the golden mean, in the midpoint between 2 extremes. Excess on the one hand, which means to have too much of something, and deficiency on the other, which means to lack something. And Aristotle said that virtue is a characteristic marked by choice. So remember, it's something that you choose. He gives the individual a lot of responsibility and a lot of autonomy. And he said virtue is a mean with respect to 2 vices, excess on the one hand and deficiency on the other. So if we just break those keywords down, choice means rational deliberation about what to do. So it's using your reasoning, which, as we know, is at the core of Aristotle's thinking. In terms of what the mean is, it's the midpoint, it's that middle ground, the golden mean. And remember, this reflects the fact that virtues lie between 2 extremes. You've got excess on one hand, which is to have too much of something, and then deficiency on the other, which is to lack something. Being virtuous is therefore to act and feel in the middle ground. So it's all about balance, really, isn't it? So it's about knowing when you should do something and what your feelings should be directed towards. So it's about, I would say, a lot of emotional intelligence as well. And we're going to talk about this in a bit more detail, because here is a little graphic for you. As you can see, I've spent a lot of money on this that shows you where the virtue is located. And it is located in that golden mean, in that midpoint. So a moral virtue is the mean, it's the midpoint between 2 vices. One of deficiency, having too little, and one of excess, having too much. And so again, it reflects the fact this is all about balance in your life. And remember, there is one exception to this, which is justice. Justice has no excess or deficiency. Instead, Aristotle said it is every virtue summed up, illustrating the importance of justice in his moral thinking. Now, let's have a look at some concrete examples here. So for the virtue of courage, for example, the deficiency of that is fear, whereas the excess is rashness, and courage is the golden mean between those 2. For temperance, our deficiency is abstinence, and then our excess is indulgence. So again, temperance is that golden mean, it is that midpoint between the 2. And then finally, generosity, our deficiency is meanness, whereas our excess is wastefulness, so being far too generous. And then in the middle, that golden mean, the midpoint, is generosity itself. So if we just go back, as you can see, we perform the virtues well by remembering that they are at that golden mean. They are the midpoint between 2 vices, excess on one hand and deficiency on the other. So in terms then of actually applying virtue ethics, if we were asked in the exam to apply virtue ethics to one of the human or non-human moral issues, what would we actually write about? Well, here I've put for you some of the key applications that I want you to consider. And I would always say pick 2 or 3 that you will use in your essay. So, for example, if you were being asked to apply to one of the animal moral issues, so something to do with the human use of animals, I would be referring to the hierarchy of souls, because remember, Aristotle believed that human life is more important and valuable than the lives of plants and animals, because we have a rational soul. So you could talk there about virtue ethics actually excusing and allowing the use of animals and plants in ways that are advantageous for human beings, because you could say that, we might be able to test on animals, for example, to cure human diseases, and that would then help humans to achieve eudaimonia in their lives. So always refer to that hierarchy of souls, which says human life is more valuable because we have that ability to reason, if you are writing about animal issues. If you are writing about one of the human issues, always link to eudaimonia and the idea that Aristotle would say, do what leads to eudaimonia. Does this action contribute to human flourishing and fulfillment? He said that eudaimonia is activity in accordance with excellence. What a brilliant quote there. And then for all of the issues that come up, so whether it is a human or non-human moral issue, make sure you're referring to your virtues. So refer to justice, prudence, temperance and fortitude, refer to phronesis, the importance of having practical wisdom, and also refer, of course, to the golden mean. Think about whether that thing is a midpoint between an excess or deficiency. You could say, for example, designer babies could not be, because it is an excess. It's going too far, isn't it? You're not exercising prudence or temperance there. But you could say, well, actually, yeah, designer babies does actually uphold fortitude, because you're being courageous. You're trying something new that human beings haven't done before. So that's how I would approach those application questions. Think about the key components of virtue ethics and then apply them to the issue. So as I say, if it is about animals, refer to the hierarchy of souls. If it is about humans, refer to eudaimonia. And for whatever issue it is, refer to particular virtues, refer to the golden mean, and refer to phronesis. Okay, let's talk about our contemporary scholars now, because although Aristotle came up with all of this over 2,000 years ago, there has been a contemporary revival in virtue ethics. In particular, with the decline of religion and religious ethics, there has been this resurgence in interest around his virtue ethics. And one person that has been really interested in virtue ethics and has promoted virtue ethics in the modern world is Martha Nussbaum. And as we said, she said Aristotle's norm of a reasonable person is one whose character is infused completely by the correct reason for action, which have shaped all their motives and attitudes. Because he aims to describe the cultivation of a whole person and a way of life, rather than simply to prescribe a list of duties, he has ample scope for discussing emotional self-shaping. So obviously things like emotional intelligence are very trendy and very popular in the world today. Things like mental health as well, personal well-being, personal growth, personal development, fulfilling your potential. They're all now buzzwords that life coaches and psychologists are using today. And actually, this is all very evident in Aristotle's writing. So Nussbaum says that, his virtue ethics is particularly suited to the modern world, because people in the modern world do value this kind of holistic approach to ethics that is concerned not with prescribing rules, but actually with personal development. So this is something that would be very appealing to many people today and very attractive to a modern audience in terms of, what they would like to see in an ethical theory. They don't want to be told what to do. They don't want a list of rules. They want, or they would like, we could say, something that empowers them as an individual to think about their personal development and personal growth, because they are now buzzwords that people talk about today, aren't they? And it's interesting to think that Aristotle was talking about this within the framework of his ethics over 2,000 years ago, showing us that his ethics are particularly suited to today's 21st century society. And somebody who has spoken a lot about this is Barry Schwartz. He gave a very famous TED talk on virtue ethics and phronesis, which I really recommend you actually go and watch on YouTube next. So he said, and this is a brilliant quote, that moral skill is chipped away by an over-reliance on rules. So again, he really likes the fact that Aristotle didn't give people a list of rules to follow. He didn't prescribe this list of duties that we all need to adhere to. Instead, he's interested in your personal development, in the cultivation of moral excellence, developing moral virtues, so you can decide for yourself. So you actually have autonomy, you can be trusted. And again, it reflects that fact and that idea that somebody who has moral virtue is more likely to be ethical than someone that just follows the rules. So what did Barry Schwartz say in his TED Talk? Well, I've summarized some of the key points for you here. He said that people are not born wise. They become wise through experience. And that is something that takes time. And remember, Aristotle said that one swallow does not make a summer. So becoming virtuous, becoming a Pheronimos is the task of a lifetime. So again, people would like that, wouldn't they, in the modern world, that idea of a journey that we're going on. He said we cannot just rely on following rules and procedures. He said there needs to be some practical wisdom involved as well. So we can't all be robots just following the rules. It doesn't work, because what if someone then goes, well, I don't want to follow the rule, and they're then breaking the rules? He said that rules and procedures spare us from thinking, and that an over-reliance on using rules and incentives to condition people's behaviours is a war on wisdom. I love that phrase, and moral skill. So he says in the modern world, wisdom has been lost. You know, people don't want or value wisdom anymore, and he wants to see a revival and a resurgence in that, because otherwise we just become robots following the rules because we've been conditioned by rewards or the fear of punishment. So think about within religion, for example, you follow the rules because you want to go to heaven and you're scared of going to hell. But actually, Schwartz wants us to think for ourselves. He wants us to work out and reason in our own minds why we're taking a particular course of action. Because if you have got that buy-in yourself, then you could say that you are more likely to do that thing repeatedly. Because if you're just following it or doing it, to follow the rules, then, you know, if suddenly those consequences disappear or you think no one's watching, are you still going to do the right thing? So if people just follow the law because they don't want to be put in jail, is that really what morality should be? Or should it be about you knowing and deciding for yourself that it is the right thing to do because you've got that practical wisdom, because you've become a Pheronimos, because you are morally virtuous? So as we've mentioned, he says that there shouldn't be this over-reliance on using rules. He said, you know, and he's quite critical of the education system today. He said education today doesn't give people scripts. It follows, no, sorry, let me start that again. Talking of scripts, I clearly can't read mine. Do excuse me. He said education doesn't give people skills today. He says the education system today just follows a script, and that just leads to mediocrity. He said it just leads to people being average, because education isn't teaching people how to think for themselves. It's not teaching them to be creative. It's not teaching them to use their reasoning. Instead, it's about memorizing things to pass an exam. He said this leads to mediocrity. Therefore, whilst we do need rules, so he acknowledges we do need rules in order for society to function, we need to realise that too many prevents improvisation and leads to people losing their gifts, because it leads to mediocrity. And so you don't get that greatness that comes from individuality and creative thinking. We can't come up with new ideas if we're all just memorising and regurgitating those that already exist. He said people need principles, not just incentives. You can't just incentivize them to follow the rules. They need to have principles like virtues within themselves. And he said that any work you do with people is moral work. So any time that you interact with another human being, that is moral work, because it says a lot about your worldview and how you believe the world should be. He said teachers need to be moral role models, modelling at all times what it means to exercise practical wisdom, because as we know, Aristotle said emulation is so important for the development of virtue. And he said that teachers need to be teaching students virtues and developing their characters. So they shouldn't just be teaching you to pass an exam or to get a qualification. They should actually be teaching you to become a virtuous person. They should be developing your character. And that means teaching you to display the right virtues at the right time and in the right way, because that is what practical wisdom is. And the key example, the key case study he gives is the hospital janitor. And he says a good hospital janitor is someone that does not just follow a rigid job description. They also need to exercise practical wisdom. And he said that is something that comes with experience over time doing the job, working with real people in the real world. So if a hospital janitor is just following their job description, then their job description is to make sure that every room in that hospital is clean, isn't it? Because that is their duty, that is their job. That's what's written down on your job description. So imagine they're doing this cleaning and they come to one room, a private room, and they think, right, well, that's the room I've got to clean next. My job description says you've got to clean every room. I need to go in and clean that room. But they look into that room and there is somebody who is dying. There's somebody that is dying and their family are around them saying their final goodbyes to that person. Now, based on that job description, the janitor should just walk straight in there and start mopping the floors and cleaning things around the family and the person who is dying. But if that janitor has got phronesis, if they've got practical wisdom, they're able to think for themselves, well, even though my CV, even though my job description, not CV, sorry, even though my job description says I need to clean every room, I'm not going to go into that room right now, because I can see that there is an emotional moment going on. I can see that this person and their family need some space and time. And so I'm going to go and do another job and then come back to this room. And that is what the janitor with phronesis, with practical wisdom, is able to do, rather than just, if they're just a robot following rules, marching on in and just cleaning around the family and that person. So, as I say, it's about making sure the individual is able to think, that they are not overly reliant on rules, that they're not conditioned to follow a script, but they're able to actually think for themselves. And that is what phronesis is, that practical wisdom, displaying the right virtues at the right time and in the right way. And as we mentioned before, phronesis is practical wisdom, and that phronimos, the person with practical wisdom, knows when to follow the rule and when to ignore it, how to improvise, how to use their skills in pursuit of the right aim, and that wisdom depends on experience, that it's all about learning on the job, reflecting the fact that becoming virtuous and therefore achieving eudaimonia is the task of a lifetime. So let's have a look at some AO2 evaluation, shall we? What do we like about virtue ethics and what problems can we identify? What are the weaknesses? What are the criticisms that could be made? Well, we're going to look at 3 for each, and it's important that you're then making a judgment. Which one do you think is the strongest strength, which is the best piece of evidence in support of virtue ethics, but then also what is the strongest weakness? Which one do you think is the most robust criticism of Aristotle's virtue ethics? Because then you can do your critical analysis and talk about whether the strengths are actually strengths, or whether you could say this argument is fatally flawed, and the same for your weaknesses as well. So remember, to get that A star, you've got to be engaging in that critical analysis. Don't just present the strengths and the weaknesses. You need to tell me, is that a good strength or is that a weak weakness? Let's have a look then at our strengths. So we're going to start with Anscombe. So along with Schwartz and Nussbaum, she is one of those who have revived virtue ethics in the modern world. She said that it's valuable in the modern world as it does not depend on God. She says people today in the modern world don't want to accept God as the source of morality. And so if that's the case, we can't turn to the Bible, can we, for our moral guidelines? Instead, we must return to the early way of thinking about goodness. She believed there should be a revival in Aristotle's virtue ethics, which predate, as we know, Christianity. Virtue ethics provides an approach to morality that, as we know, does not depend on belief in God. It highly values reason, which of course would be seen as a very appealing thing today, and it's consistent with that belief that we learn through experience. So Anscombe is saying there that it's a very valuable ethical approach for the modern world, for a modern audience, because it doesn't depend on deriving morality from God, and it actually empowers the individual to think for themselves and to learn through experience, which are things which would be seen as appealing to a modern audience. We could say it would also be seen as appealing because it is holistic and human-centered. Remember that brilliant quote from Nussbaum that Aristotle aims to describe the cultivation of the whole person. So why are we going to see it as a strength that it is focused on cultivating the whole person rather than just prescribing a list of duties? Well, we can say that this values human life and it promotes human flourishing. Let's link that to eudaimonia. It prioritizes people and emphasizes the importance of investing in their moral development. So again, that would be seen as appealing and attractive in the modern world. It recognizes that people are not perfect and that they continue to develop throughout life. Now, in terms of your critical analysis, you could also say that the fact it's human-centered is problematic because of the implication for animals and the environment, that it could justify harming animals in the name of promoting eudaimonia, but more on that when we look at the weaknesses. One final strength, let's bring in Barry Schwartz. He said it gives people autonomy. He warned, didn't he, that moral skill is chipped away by an over-reliance on rules. Virtue ethics ensures that people develop moral skill by developing phronesis, that practical wisdom. Why is that a strength? Why is that a good thing? Well, we can say it empowers the individual and it gives them autonomy to make moral decisions and judgments. So again, which do you think is the strongest strength? Which of these is going to sell virtue ethics and show that it is a good approach to ethics? Do let me know what you think, by the way, in the comments. Let's have a look now at the weaknesses, shall we? We could say a weakness of this is the cultural relativism of virtues. So we could say those virtues that Aristotle promoted, such as prudence, justice, temperance, and fortitude, might not be seen as important as they were then. So they are relative to that ancient Greek context, to ancient Athens. We could say that 2000 years later, trends have changed, society has changed, which means virtues, we could argue, have also changed. We could then also say that different countries and cultures around the world prioritize different virtues and promote different values. We could say that Aristotle's virtue ethics, developed in the context of ancient Athens, may be seen as outdated and that it cannot be universally applied because different cultures and different people have different virtues. We could also go further and say that society actually does need clear rules to follow. So you could say that natural moral law, for example, is a better approach to ethics because those 5 primary precepts lead to secondary precepts, which can then form rules to follow. We could say virtue ethics, in contrast, is flawed because human beings need clear rules to follow for everyday life. We could say it gives too much responsibility to the individual, which could undermine social order and also be exploited. Ethics should provide clearer rules and principles for people to follow in everyday situations. So is it too idealistic? Does it work in theory? But actually, when you think about 8 billion people on a planet, does this work, or do we actually need more rules that people should just be following because they are incentivized to do so? Can we actually trust people? Of course, you could respond to that, and you should respond to that by saying, but if the education is right and if there are good role models in society, we won't have that problem. But of course, it relies on getting all those key components right as the individual, grows up. Because the moment they go on TikTok and they see bad influences, all of that good work by good role models is going to be undone, isn't it? So could we end up with a situation where the wrong virtues are promoted and cultivated? Finally, we have to remember our animals and our plants, don't we? We could say it's too anthropocentric because virtue ethics prioritizes and promotes the achievement of eudaimonia, which is flourishing for human beings. As we know, we can say that's great. However, what is the implication, as I mentioned, for our plants and animals? The hierarchy of souls values human life above that of animals and plants. We could say this prioritization of human beings could be criticized as it could justify harm to animals and even the planet if advantageous to human beings. And I've put that, make sure you link that to the issues of non-human life and death. Now, of course, in terms of your critical analysis there, you could say that argument is fatally flawed because virtue ethics is about that golden mean, and that anything that does cause harm would be seen as an excess, for example. You could say temperance, justice, prudence. They are obviously cardinal virtues, and they are about being responsible. So actually, no, this doesn't end up justifying achieving eudaimonia by any means possible, because temperance, for example, is all about self-control. You could also say that Phronimos, an expert in practical wisdom, would actually have expertise to know, no, you can't destroy the planet in order to promote eudaimonia, because that's going to be counterintuitive. But always be thinking with these strengths and weaknesses, is it a good evaluative point? What objection could I make to it? Because that's where you'll get your critical analysis, by using phrases such as, this argument is fatally flawed, or this is a successful argument because. And that does bring today's video to an end. Thank you very much for joining me. I do hope that's been helpful. I absolutely love virtue ethics, actually, and I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on it in the comments below. So yes, thank you for joining me and have a great day.